Hello, and welcome to Creative Banter, a creativity and philosophy-focused podcast where anything goes. I'm your host, Cody Schultz. Joining me is the one and only Ben Horn. In this episode, we are discussing the monetization of photography projects, along with our influences in landscape photography, and how we can use jealousy as motivation instead of allowing it to run us down. Let's dive right into it, shall we? So I got an email from one of our listeners the other week, and they were saying about the whole idea of having further discussion, particularly about the episodes and expanding upon the topics that we're talking about. And he was pretty much asking if there's any way that we would be interested in doing something like that, which I think is a great idea. I would love to get our listeners more involved into these discussions that we're having and just really expand the topics themselves, because there's so many different inputs and viewpoints that other people can bring into this that could be beneficial, not just to some people that are just starting out, but also even to you and I who have been doing this for a while.
Yeah, for sure.
The one thing that they had brought up, though, was about doing a Patreon and starting that up, simply because that's probably the more popular route when it comes to something like this, and to have a discussion-based platform like that. The issue with that, at least as I see it, and from how we've talked about it a little bit off air, so to speak, it seems difficult to tell when you should start monetizing your photography or monetizing a creative project.
Yeah.
Like, we are recording the 9th episode now. We have 4 episodes that are released as of right now. At what point is it the right time to even think about opening up a Patreon and asking for viewer contributions, if at all? Because at the end of the day, this especially was started as a passion project, a project of love, rather than something that I ever really considered getting any kind of sponsorships or any kind of money out of.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it costs time and money to be able to put this together. So you have that weird dichotomy of, like, when is the right time to even think about it?
Yeah, because it changes the dynamics of things. It changes the influence of things. And I will say that that's something that I am rather familiar with based on the time I've spent doing the YouTube videos and everything else. Because this podcast, it started, like you said, it started as just like a passion project, something to get together, talk about things in a format that is better for that than, YouTube videos or the tiny, a sentence or two at a time based on social media. But ultimately it does take time. But I think it really is a matter of keeping true to the roots as to why we're doing this, but also looking at it realistically from the standpoint that, it does take time to sit down and record, to prep for it. And then, you do all the editing of the audio and take time to post it and everything else. But also, it's the sort of thing where I would never want to have, like blatant ad breaks or anything during the podcast, because it goes against everything that I think people really appreciate about a podcast, where it's just conversation, something to listen to while doing something else. And so I think you and I are very like-minded about that. And I think also we probably wouldn't have even started doing this if we had, if one of us or the other was like, oh, we're going to, monetize this right away. It's just not really where this is coming from.
I mean, we had talked before, too, about the whole sponsorship ideal. After one of our episodes, we were done recording, and it was brought up about how I don't even know if I would want this to be sponsored by anyone.
No.
Because, like you were mentioned, now all of a sudden you got to figure out where you're going to put the ad breaks. Are you going to break this conversation midway through, which is just going to completely destroy the flow of the listening? Or are you going to put something in the beginning or at the end? And there's so much to go into it that unless someone would come to us and be like, hey, put a link in your description and that's all that you need.
Yeah.
Then
something that's passive.
Yeah. Something that just our podcast stays exactly as it is and how we want to control it. And it's just the sponsorship, so to speak, is just down with the show notes, and that's it.
Yeah.
But I mean, even then, it's one of those things where you got to talk about it because you got to watch who's sponsoring you and what kind of message they convey then too, and does it align with our morals and what we believe in as individuals and as photographers.
And it really does. Anytime something like that is introduced, it really changes it does change the motivation behind things, and it changes the direction of things. Sort of in the same way that on YouTube, so many channels start out being they're very unique, they're very personalized, and then oftentimes they start gravitating towards a certain thing because of the draw of the ad revenue and everything else and trying to get the attention on it. And that's something that I've always actively resisted. But the thought of a Patreon is interesting because it would give a format for people to be able to voice their opinion on things in a way that we could interact, especially since I have a minimal presence on social media these days. I'm on there now, but I'm not anywhere like I was before. And you've sort of sworn away with it, which is amazing. But ultimately, a lot of people like podcasts and stuff, they'll turn to social media for that. But also it takes so much time and so much energy to respond in that way. And then you get sucked into it, and then you're just doom scrolling for hours on end, which is, one of the things I've been trying to avoid and have successfully avoided for a while now.
I would love to have a platform where if we're going to have discussions around each of these episodes or something, that because with social media you end up with, like we were mentioning, these real short responses and that kind of thing. It's not like in depth, and that's something that I'd like to see more of. Like if we're going to do this, I want to do it right. So I want to have people that are actually involved in the conversation who want to be, because not everyone is going to want that or get enjoyment from that, which is fine. But if you want to be involved, I want it to be conducive where everyone can be involved and not have to be scrolling through a bunch of spam comments like you get on social media in order to actually engage with one another. And so I definitely think that Patreon would be a better route for that, because then it has the ability to monetize if we would want to, or get contributions if we would want to.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to lie. I set up a Patreon earlier today just because I was bored trying to distract myself from schoolwork. I set one up for our podcast here. And so everything's ready to go. I didn't go through on any create tiers or anything. I just have it sitting kind of dormant. It's not launched yet.
Yeah.
Just so that way we have, if and when we decide to do it, all we have to do is pretty much press a button and it's live. But one thing that I was thinking with that is, what is stopping us from setting up this Patreon and having it free?
That's true.
Anyone can go onto the Patreon. we can set up tiers so we have, how many is it? 2 or 3 episodes right now that are unreleased that we are deeming as like potential bonus episodes.
Yeah.
And those are easy enough to create too, just like after after recording conversations, that kind of thing. We could always just set up tiers where at any tier you get access to those if you want to contribute. And if you don't want to contribute, each week we put up a discussion.
Yeah.
That's free. Anyone can go on there.
That's a good approach.
Anyone can chime in and have their own say in it. But at the same time, if people want to contribute, they have the freedom to. And there's no force. Nothing's forced.
Yeah. That to me is a very good approach because it avoids the paywall where stuff is hidden behind the paywall. And that, which is something I've been trying to avoid with my own stuff. I do have a Patreon for my YouTube channel, though I post the videos a few days early on there, but there's nothing else beyond that hidden behind the paywall. But I see it mostly as a way that people who, if that's how they're comfortable, contributing, it's an option that's available. And for the podcast, that would be good to have the ability where everyone can access it. Though, those that do enjoy this, those that do want to contribute and help support us and have basically to keep having more of this, these podcasts out there, it would give the ability for them to help out. So to me, that sounds like a good solution of avoiding the paywall, but also having the ability for people to support and also giving a place for people to voice their opinion on various things that come up in the podcast.
I mean, this is like I said, the 9th episode that we're recording. So based on our schedule, this will go out like mid-July, I believe, is when it will be published. So I'm going to put it out to our listeners and let them decide what they think, if they think that's a good idea. So I want to hear from those listening. If you think that we should create this Patreon as I described, so free to join in on the discussion, but you get some bonuses, some bonus episodes, that kind of thing, for contributing at any level, but keep it real basic.
Yeah.
I want to hear what everyone thinks about that before we really decide to go live with this, because I'm in no rush to monetize or make anything off of this. I don't care if I never make a dime off of this, but I would love to have those kind of conversations.
So should they just email you?
Absolutely. Yeah. Send either Ben or I an email. Both of our emails should be down in the show notes, and I'd love to hear what you all think.
Cool. I'm curious to hear as well, because like from my standpoint, I'm just sitting in my incredibly hot home office right now with no fan going. And it's weird for me to think that this is going out and then there's people listening to this as they're going about their daily life, taking their dog for a walk, doing everything they're doing. It's hard to wrap my mind around it, quite honestly. But it's been a really fun project thus far, and I do enjoy, sitting down with you every week and talking about all kinds of fun photography stuff that comes up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely glad to hear that you enjoy it too, because I'm really enjoying it more than I thought that I would when we first started with it too. And I know that you felt similarly in the beginning, but
yeah, so for those that are listening, Cody brought it up as, I've got this idea, maybe we could do this podcast. And I'll say I was a little resistant at first, because if I'm scripted in the way that I am when recording the voiceovers for the YouTube videos, I can sound poetic. I can sound like I know what I'm talking about. But if there's just a hot mic and I'm talking, I was just worried it would just be a complete mess. But somehow it seems to be coherent. And, I've, as much as I resist listening to podcasts that I've been on, I've listened to all the episodes when they've come out, so I can also remember what I've talked about. But it sounds like we've been doing this for a while, but we're kind of making it up as we go along. So,
Yeah, I mean, to think that this just started as a school project, and
yeah,
I remember we recorded like the first one, and I brought it up about doing this like possibly long term, because this is something that I've been heavily thinking about, and you thought before a couple of years
yeah,
ago about doing a podcast, but it never formulated. And to think how hesitant, especially you were, not necessarily because of any like abstract fear or something like that, but like you were saying about the being able to sound coherent, but also
yeah,
the time commitment to it.
yeah.
But then you realized, oh wait, this guy's gonna do everything, and I just have to talk for an hour.
Yeah, I just have to sit sweating in my office with locking the dogs and cats out, and
The
not
most I have to
running
do
the,
is
the
post
fan.
about it on social media and maybe make a
Yeah.
video or two on YouTube, and then I'm good. And just be rolling in
"Oh,
whatever cash we get.
It's not so bad. Yeah. um.
Nah, but it's
So
been great.
yeah, I've definitely enjoyed it. And in all reality, we probably should have started doing this during the course of the pandemic.
Oh my
to,
god, that would have been so much
help that
nicer.
time. Oh yeah,
But
but
hey, it happens.
yeah. But I was thinking about something. It's been a year now, as of at the time of the recording this. So we're recording this in middle part of June, and coming up on June 14th. So next week, at the time of the recording this, it'll be 1 year since we adopted our dog Oliver. He was a handful when we first got him. He had no training. He had been adopted during the pandemic as a puppy, and the person didn't give him any training, then went back to work and surrendered him to a rescue, and we got him and we did all the work. But it was a very stressful and hectic time. And it was about at that same time that I decided to take on a project of re-landscaping my front yard of my house. So it was a lot of work, and it took me, I was surprised by this, but it took me about 3 weeks, maybe a little more than 3 weeks, in the heat of summer of doing this landscaping project. And so we have a decent sized front yard, but a really small backyard. And so there's a lawn, there's a couple elm trees, and then there's this border that goes along the street, which is maybe 6-7 feet wide, but runs the entire length of the property, and then it kind of dips in and out a few times, and there was like no landscaping there, and it was an eyesore. And so I had this idea of just redoing it. And so the project involved several weeks of digging, like getting up early in the morning, digging up dirt, moving it around, digging up rocks, moving it around, and taking everything that was there and essentially rearranging it. Like taking what was flat dirt, but digging out some areas lower to put some mulch in, but then you have this extra dirt, which then mounds up, and then all the hard work was really rearranging everything that was already there and not really getting rid of anything. But at the last little part of the project, I had this a huge amount of composted mulch delivered, and then I also had some decomposed granite, and I got some plants. So it was the superficial stuff that everyone can see when looking at the front yard. They see the mulch and the plants and everything, but all the time and effort was really spent on basically working with what was already there and just kind of rearranging it. And this got me thinking a little bit about art and about influences, because I had a lot of time to think when I was out there for 3 weeks moving dirt around. Meanwhile, the dog was eating my running shoes inside the house and pooping on the carpet. So it was
Nice.
It was a lot of work, but it got me thinking about influences when it comes to the art world, and how something like working on the front yard of my house was a matter of taking something that already existed and modifying it a little bit. But it wasn't something that, basically all the hard work was taking something that was already there in the same way that if we look at our influences when it comes to art world, the art that we create is never really 100% unique. It's built upon those that came before us and all the hard work that they put in. That really is sort of the underlying structure of it, because we're influenced by, various artists and, in our case, perhaps photographers and beyond. And so it got me thinking about who it was that came before us as artists that we really rely upon as an influence, and how perhaps the work that we do is kind of this almost like a surface level stuff, but built upon pre-existing styles and influences and such. And so that whole story just leading into, I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts, first of all, on that take of that, but also who were some of your influences when it comes to your art, and how do you think that has had an impact on what you do now and what you've done in the past?
If we're talking about people that have influenced me, or other photographers or artists,
Yeah.
that's a big difference between what primarily influences me now. There is a major shift in how I perceived influences.
Mm-hmm.
So when I first started out with photography, a lot of the influence that was brought on to me was from other photographers, namely, of course, Ansel Adams.
Mm-hmm.
But also there were guys like, why am I blanking on names now?
I'm horrible with names, so I don't have them written down. I'm not going to come up with them.
Just a lot of like the more popular landscape and nature photographers on the internet and on like Instagram and all of that. I was influenced by a lot of their work, but the problem with that, being in Pennsylvania, is they were all out west. I don't think, like, Elliot Porter is known for his like forest work, and he's about the only one that was from around this general area of the East Coast, at least that I became aware of and am aware of now. And I'm sure there are others, but he was one of the bigger ones. But even him, I didn't really get any influence by until later on. So primarily, it was these photographers out west that I was looking at their work, and then you had the jealousy aspect of, I wish I was out there with them and being able to have what they have. But now, most of my influences are from nature itself, or from, oddly enough, like authors of books, and not necessarily the authors themselves, but the concepts that they bring about.
Yeah.
And the thinking that all goes into that. I mean, yeah, I have some influences. I mean, I'm always influenced by your work, Ben. Guys like Guy Tall and Joel Truckenbrod, and the list goes on. There's Simon Baxter is a big one too. But
yeah,
at the same time, as much as I'm influenced by their work and as much as I derive pleasure from viewing it, it's nature that pushes me in that kind of influential way and keeps me going.
That's awesome. And I think that shows, because certainly taking inspiration from nature, it's like an endless bounty of inspiration to be found there.
And you can't be jealous of it or compared to it.
Yeah, that's very true. And you're never going to fully be able to like capture the essence of what it is. So it's something that can last a lifetime. And I'll say that I am inspired by nature, but it feels like it's a different sort of relationship than you have with it. And also I'll say that I identify with, you mentioned having influences early on versus currently. Early on, I'll say that I'm not very well versed on the photographers that came before me. Not as much as I probably should. I think I've intentionally avoided looking at their work, probably for fear of jealousy or for fear of kind of in some way copying what they do or just, putting that picture in my mind a bit. But I do remember on I think it was my 2007 trip with my wife where we stopped through Zion National Park, Michael Fatali, who's a large format photographer. He had a gallery at that time that was right at the entrance to the park. And I remember walking in there, and I was a little hesitant to walk in there at first because I think I had a fear of being intimidated by seeing, these beautiful large photographic prints. And they were all Cibachrome prints, printed in the dark room, just like, the real stuff.
Yeah.
I do remember walking in there, and suddenly that feeling of perhaps being intimidated by it just went away. And I was just lost in some of those images. So I'll say that early on, I was very much inspired by viewing his work in person. But then, as you had mentioned, our influences change a little bit with time. Then I became a little bit more drawn to some of the photographers that have come before me, and I perhaps wasn't aware of them until someone said, "Hey, you should check out so-and-so's work." And that's where I really started having a bit of a deeper dive. I'd say, are you familiar with Philip Hyde?
I'm not, no.
So he was instrumental in the formation of Redwood National and State Parks.
Okay.
So his work has been used for some really fantastic environmental causes. And he also has done, he did a lot of photography in some of the canyons and areas where I recently returned from my spring trip. And so his work, because it has a bit of a sort of the environmental message behind it and the power of photography. And along those same lines, you had also mentioned drawing work from authors. Was there any particular type of writing or literature that you were drawing inspiration from?
A lot of it is like along the philosophical or psychological lines. And it's the concepts in those books that I'm relating to and that I can relate to my photography primarily through my writing, but it also helps me to see the world in a different way, which in turn helps me to photograph in a more meaningful manner because it's more true to myself then.
And that's certainly the goal behind it. Do you think that's something where if there was a particular image, for example, that, well, do you have any specific images that you can say are attributed to inspiration from any particular writing or anything like that? Or is it just more of a broader theme?
It's more of a broader theme. I don't know if I
Okay.
could narrow down any specific. Yeah, no, I'd say it's broad.
Have you ever read anything from Edward Abbey?
Not yet. He wrote Desert Solitaire, didn't he?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was getting at.
Yeah. Guy Tall speaks about him a lot in some of his writings, and it's on my list. But let me tell you, Ben, I have about 35 books right now between my Kindle and physical copies that I need to read. And yeah, my girlfriend and I like to go to Barnes and Noble on the weekends here and there, probably like twice a month. And yeah, it's not good.
Yeah, I don't have quite as large of a backlog because I have usually one book that's the one that's coming up. But I don't remember who it was, but someone, I think it was after perhaps posting one of the video series, someone recommended that I read Desert Solitaire from Edward Abbey, and I was a bit familiar with his name. I was just a little bit, and it was really interesting because having visited some of the places I love visiting in Utah, and then reading about similar areas, and the way he described them, and the way he has this love of the landscape. It was really interesting because there's a few things in particular that really stand out when hiking through the various canyons in southern Utah. And one of them is the song of a particular bird. And it's called a canyon wren. And it's this tiny, tiny little bird. You never really see them, but you hear them. They have this very signature call. And the fact that he references the song of the canyon wren, I think it was within the first several pages of the book. It was at least within the first chapter or so. The moment I read that, it gave me like chills where I'm kind of like, all right, I'm in on this. And I don't remember what the other thing was. I think he mentioned reflected light or something along those lines. And here I'm thinking, all right, we got canyon wrens, we got reflected light.
That's all you.
This is, oh yeah, this is me. And I'm not sure if you would relate as much, since it's not an area that you're as familiar with, to read an area that is, that you may not be as familiar with, to hear those descriptions. It might not strike you quite as much, but you would certainly, I think, better understand his love for the place based on his stories. And I know he has other books too, and those are ones that I would also plan to read. But it was interesting that you mentioned literature, because this is one of the things I had written down was Edward Abbey. And then also we spoke last week, or I don't know if it was last week. Maybe it was the episode I listened to. Maybe it was the one recorded. But either way, Christopher Burkett, his work's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah.
And I think I can better appreciate their work now without the feeling of jealousy that would perhaps come with it if I was viewing it from a place of not already having found, the particular style and subjects and light and sort of stuff that already appeals to me. I think I'd be very envious of all their work, but I think I can appreciate it more now that I've reached an area where I'm quite satisfied with my own work. Do you find anything along those lines with your work in terms of being able to look back at artists that have inspired you? What are your feelings when viewing their work currently about artists that have inspired you in the past?
Like you were saying, I don't get near as jealous of a lot of the people that I've looked at in the past. And I think that really has to do with my better understanding that those are areas that I'm not connected to in the same way that I am with the forest.
Yeah.
So looking at the work of Ansel Adams, yeah, he has some work in the forest, but it's not to the same degree that I'm photographing. And even Elliot Porter, I'll look at a lot of his work, and I think because there's the detachment between my shooting black and white and his primarily being color, I don't, again, have that kind of tinge of jealousy in it. But I will say that looking at Simon Baxter's work, I still get tinges of jealousy.
Even though he works in color and you're in black and white?
Yeah. So I'm not sure why there's that dichotomy with Elliot Porter that I've gotten over, but with Baxter there's not. And perhaps it's to do with him being almost seen as competition, so to speak, because I'm not competing against Elliot Porter in terms of market space. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He's long gone at this point, but with Baxter, I'm still at that same level, so to speak. We're still currently alive.
Yeah,
that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, that's a very fascinating fact, and I hadn't really thought about that. But the other aspect is, a contemporary photographer who's actively creating work versus a photographer who's no longer with us and has this body of work. That's something I hadn't really thought about, but that does make a lot of sense. And do you think there's a way of harnessing the power of jealousy? And maybe jealousy is not the right word, but do you think there's a way of harnessing that power to make us better photographers?
It takes a lot of effort. There's a certain level of maturity I think that you have to reach in your, both in your life, but especially in your photography specifically, before you can say, I'm influenced by this person, but not jealous of them. And even with having a little tinge of jealousy, there's things that you can do with that to put it to your advantage, just like expectations, which we had talked about in a previous episode.
Yeah.
You can have expectations when going out into the field, but not let them take over. And I think jealousy is the same thing.
Yeah.
You can be jealous of someone's work, but instead of sitting down and saying, oh, I wish I could photograph like them, and having that jealousy destroy you and demotivate you, instead you can use that jealousy and say, I wish I could photograph like him. I'm going to go out and try. I get as close as I can. I'm going to see what he's doing, like specifically with Simon Baxter. I'm going to watch his YouTube videos, see the approach that he's taking. I'm going to try and emulate that now. And I'm going to try and not necessarily copy his work, but take certain steps that he's taking as well in order to better understand the subject matter and better understand how he is making those photographs. And I think that is the more mature, so to speak, approach of using your influences.
Yeah.
Because you either do it that way, or you do what Cole Thompson has done and just go with almost complete photographic celibacy, where you're not looking at anyone's work, so therefore you can't be jealous of them. You can't get down on your own work because you don't know what other people are creating. But then that leads to issues as well.
Yeah. And as you were talking, I was thinking about something very much along the same lines. So I like going for a run early in the morning, usually well before sunrise when it's nice and cool out. And the usual running route that I take, I specifically take that route because it takes me through an even nicer neighborhood. I mean, the neighborhood I live in is fine, but if I go about 3 miles, then like the houses are nicer. They've got some nice views. They got nice swimming pools, and there's something quite nice about hiking through that neighborhood. Not hiking, but running through that neighborhood, and just thinking to myself, hey, I'd love for this to be me someday. Not using it, not being like jealous of like, oh, look at that car. Oh, they got 2 Teslas. Look at them. It's more like, hey, I would love for that to be me someday. And I find that actually helps me with the run, because it helps me. I should also say that to get to that area, there's kind of a little bit of an uphill to get to it. And then you kind of run downhill a little bit to get to this, the street ends. There's a cul-de-sac at the end. And so you got to run uphill to get back out of there. So here I am, running uphill through this neighborhood with some pretty nice houses and some nice cars and stuff. And something about being surrounded by that makes me work harder, and I get a little bit of a better workout because of it. And also, I feel like with today's culture, and this is probably something brought on by social media, if you're just sitting there in a, let's say I'm sitting here recording the podcast, and then I see a car drive by, and it's like a really nice car. I think many people would look at that and be like, oh, look at them. They're just showing off their money. And there would be this spark of jealousy. But from my standpoint, I look at that nice car driving by, and I'm like, that's kind of cool car. I wouldn't mind having one of those. I got to work hard to get that.
Yeah.
And so I think that's something that social media has brought on, where it's just, the bad side of jealousy, and not the good side of jealousy, where you can use that to make yourself a better photographer, make yourself hopefully a better person in the process. So it's very interesting to hear your take on that, and how it does indeed, inspire one to become better. But at the same time, it could be a little frustrating at times.
Yeah, It can definitely be frustrating when you see, even like you said, a real nice car drive by and you're like, oh, wonder if he can truly afford that. Like, how's he
Yeah.
affording that in this economy kind of deal.
Yeah.
But like I said, there's a certain, and I really would stick by that, calling it like a certain sense of maturity that you have to acquire in order to use that jealousy as motivation rather than as deprivation.
Yeah. So I received a very interesting email the other day,
Oh boy.
and this is a good one. This is a good one.
Okay. All right.
So it was from a photographer who I was not familiar with, and it was after I had posted the first episode of my spring backpacking trip, and he emailed me, and for those that haven't seen that video, which I assume is probably a lot of the people listening, there was this I backpacked into this canyon. I took 3 photos in one day, one of which I really liked. It was a photo of this juniper in this little Zen garden of cryptobiotic soil. But there was this other photo I shot, it was an abstract on the ground of some salt patterns coming out of the sandstone. It looked like clouds in the sky, and it was an interesting scene, though I can't say I was completely satisfied with the final image. Something about it wasn't quite right. But he emailed me saying, I was in the same canyon and I shot the exact same photo. And he doesn't know me. I didn't know him. He wasn't familiar with my work. I wasn't familiar with his work. He had never seen my YouTube channel before, but a friend of his had said, hey, you should watch this video. And sure enough, he sends me the picture. It is almost exactly the same composition, slightly different aspect ratio, but almost the exact same composition of the exact same scene. And I looked really closely at his, and I could tell that his was shot a little bit before mine, because it's a subject that you can walk over the top of, and I can tell there was a little bit of foot traffic in mine that wasn't in his. And so I was there on April 30th, and I asked him when he was there, and he said it was on April 28th. And I just found it absolutely fascinating how 2 photographers can go to the exact same spot, a fairly remote canyon that takes quite a bit of effort to get into, and shoot the exact same photo. And it shows how similar we all are in terms of the thought process, even though we think we might be completely original. But it is a thought process I think that many of us share that can lead to the exact same conclusions. And I would imagine you probably have not had anything quite like that happen before.
Well, I have one question before that.
Mm-hmm.
Did he photograph it using film?
It was not on film. It was on digital. So, though I will say that if it was on film, if he happened to shoot it also on 8x10, maybe a different film stock, but if he also happened to shoot it on 8x10, that would be even more insane.
Yeah, that would have been definitely something else. I've never experienced anything like that to that degree. I did, however, back when I had, for those few months, it was terrible few months when I was shooting digital, I had photographed some ice patterns, and what originally seemed like a pretty unique composition, it was kind of looked like a tree in the frozen lake. I was talking to Chris Murray, and as we were hanging out the one day up in New York, we were talking about this exact same idea, because he had sent out a newsletter maybe 3 weeks after I had taken this photograph that I thought was so unique,
Mm-hmm.
only to find that he had made one that was very, very similar. Exact same, like, idea.
Yeah.
So like you were saying, it's very interesting how what we often think is unique typically isn't.
Did you seen his photo, did that make you think any less of yours, or were you kind of like, all right, I think we're both onto something that I'm wondering what sort of reaction that leads to of having such a similar photo like that.
I was kind of disappointed because what I thought was like something novel turned out to be something that, yeah, it's all right.
Yeah. Interesting. And there's been a few other situations where there's been subjects that I photographed that I thought were fairly, I wouldn't say unique, but I thought it was I thought perhaps I was very lucky to stumble upon just the perfect subject at the perfect time and end up with a photo that would be difficult for others to, not that it's hard to shoot, not that it's hard to find, but I thought it would result in a photo that's perhaps something I can call my own, only to see other people photograph the exact same scene. And I think at first I was a little bummed by it, but then at a certain point, I think I just became more fascinated by the fact that two people can stand in a very similar place and shoot the very similar thing. So I don't think I'm bummed out by it. I think it's more so just fascinating, but it doesn't make me think any less of the work, I would say. But I do think it's very interesting.
I mean, I try to make my photographs as, like I said before, personally meaningful, but also as unique to my vision as I can. And so, yeah, seeing a photograph like the one that I had shot versus the one that Chris had, as fascinating as it is, I can't help but be a little disappointed that it wasn't as unique as I thought. But at the same time, though, I'm a lot less disappointed seeing a photograph like that than I would be saying or having a photograph of, say, Yellowstone or Yosemite Valley.
Yeah.
And thinking that that is unique. And then all of a sudden you realize
that's true.
Millions of people had photographed that before.
Yeah.
So that I'm less fascinated by than I am with the occurrences that we have been brought into.
There's another thing too, which I thought was kind of along these same lines. There's a particular maple grove in Zion that I had visited, I don't know, maybe it was back in 2010, somewhere in that range. I was there in the fall and I found this really cool scene, which I ended up photographing on a panoramic medium format camera that I had at the time. And it was pretty good, though I felt like it was also a scene that I could do a little better at it. And it's just, there's no real landmarks in this grove. It's fairly obscure. And so I went back there another year, and it had been some time later, and thinking I'm never going to find this exact same scene again. But sure enough, I just started wandering through it, and I ended up stumbling upon the exact same scene, even though nothing looked familiar. There was no landmarks I was navigating by. And it wasn't as good to photograph when I returned to it. But it was interesting how at every turn as I'm working my way up this hillside, I'm making decisions. Do I go straight? Do I go left? Do I go right? And, I just basically followed decision by decision the exact same decision process, which led me to the exact same area. And that brought to mind how there's this process working in the background where even though we think that something we might be doing is fairly unique, it's just built upon a structure of decisions that will, in some cases, lead other people to the exact same spot at that exact same point in time to photograph the same thing. And so I think that's also the other part of it. I think is a bit fascinating, but I will definitely agree about the sort of the iconic views. If you have this large scene that you feel might perhaps be very unique, and to find that it's not. That would definitely be a bit of a bummer, and I think it would change my opinion of that photo for sure.
There's a quote by Chuck Palahniuk. I can't pronounce his last name for the life of me. But he says, "Nothing of me is original. I am the combined effort of everyone I've ever known." And I think that sums up
It does.
everything we've talked about pretty nicely.
That really does. That's good stuff. I hope you enjoyed our creative banter. You can learn more about Cody's work by visiting his website, codyschultz.com, and you can find my work at benhorn.com. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach out to us by email at cody@codyschultz.com. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you around next time.